Hello, and welcome to your virtual lecture for the remaining slides of Chapter 11. In the previous class, we looked at the first two-thirds of the slides in Chapter 11, and there we began to look at this question of the historical Jesus. In other words, whether or not this historical figure, a character of Jesus, existed 2,000 years ago. And we began looking at external evidence of Jesus, that is, evidence of Jesus outside of the gospel, and we looked at two particular sources in Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. And in both of them, we came to see that even if they were few, they were high in quality, and so historians of today see that as being credible. Next, we looked at three interesting facets in which we can see Jesus. Whether Jesus was someone who fit historically into his time frame, ideologically into the period of the time, as well as sociologically. And we saw that historically, looking at the places and the geography of the Gospels would have been resonating with the geography of the time as well. And then in terms of the religious denominations of the time, did those denominations mentioned in the Gospels, for example, the Zealots and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so on, did they exist in the time of Jesus? And of course the answer is yes. And then we looked at the ideological fitness of Jesus, meaning was Jesus this foreign alien that appeared on the scene in the ancient Middle East? And he was not. His teachings, his message fit very much with the foundation of Judaism of the time. And so his message would have been able to be meaningful to the people. And then finally, the sociological fitness of Jesus, which looks at whether or not Jesus would have fit in the society of his time. These are anthropological questions, of course, and the main bit of evidence we have for Jesus' sociological fitness is this figure called Hanina Bendoza, who was another figure around the time of Jesus, who, like Jesus, was a healer. Like Jesus, called himself the Son of God, and like Jesus, ruffled the feathers of Jewish leaders of the time. And so from those three different facets, the sociological, ideological, and historical, we can say with some level of plausibility that a historical Jesus has grounding, and that Jesus would have existed. And so today we're going to turn our focus to Jesus and the titles attributed to him. Just a few points regarding Jesus and the titles attributed to him. In the New Testament, we find many titles ascribed to Jesus that are taken up later in Christian theology. Certainly, we've grown up, those of you who are Christians, with names for Jesus, and some of those names would have come directly from the Gospels. Others would have emerged later on. Interestingly, we have different insights about Jesus that emerged 200, 300, 400 years after in creeds. And so, for example, in one of the creeds, we see that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father. Now, interestingly, we can say Jesus probably didn't walk around saying, I'm consubstantial with my Father. It's only later that we've come to that insight. A critical historian should have some understanding of their meaning in classical Judaism, mainly these four titles that Tower and Young cover: Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man, and Lord. So we're going to turn now to each of these. So Jesus as Messiah. The inscription Pilate had affixed to Jesus' cross, which read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, was supposed to inform passers-by of the nature of the charge for which he was executed. So this is a normal Roman practice, that people were crucified, their crimes labeled on top of them, as a warning to all those Roman citizens out there who are thinking about breaking the law. And Jesus was no different, and the inscription on top of his head was Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And if you see a crucifix today, you can see the letters I-N-R-I. I for Jesus, N for Nazareth, R for King, which is the Latin word rex, of the Jews, I. And so it reflects information found in both Josephus and Tacitus that Jesus was regarded by some as the Messiah. So he was executed because he was understood to be the Messiah. Not all Jews during the 1st century CE expected a Messiah. Those who did most commonly believed that God would restore the anointed Davidic line to the throne of Israel and, in the process, restore the Israelite kingdom, and in the process, change the world. Before this period, we looked at the Maccabean period and the Hasmonean family that took control following the Greeks and before the Romans. And there we saw that it was not a Davidic line, and therefore some of the Jews did not see its authenticity or credibility. And so by the time of Jesus, maybe the thought had been abandoned by some, and maybe for a few, if there was a Messiah, it would be someone who might be more military as opposed to what we see in Jesus. There can be no doubt that Jesus' followers proclaimed him the Messiah. Of course, the name of Jesus for the faithful is Jesus Christ, and the word Christ comes from the Greek Christos, which is a literal translation of Hebrew Mashiach, which means anointed one. So, did Jesus call himself Messiah? In short, yes. The Gospel of Mark, which we'll look at in a little while, features this theme, the messianic secret. And that's where Jesus in the Gospel constantly tells people who recognize that he's the Christ to shush. As well, we can look at Jesus' answer to Pontius Pilate as being a guarded one. Understandably, if he were to come outright and say that I'm the king of the Jews, or the Messiah come to save the Israelites, he would be executed. And finally, a case can be made that he never explicitly claimed the title Messiah for himself, but in so doing, this would turn his execution into a tragic case of mistaken identity. And so he has to have said that, or many of those who were his followers also accepted that very strongly. Continuing on with the question, did Jesus call himself Messiah? There are several points at which Jesus appears clearly to have asserted his messianic identity. His answer to the high priest in the Gospel of Mark, in that scene where he's presented before the council, is interesting. If you turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 14, verse 62, here we see Jesus presented before the council. It reads from verse 61, "But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' The guards also took him over and beat him." So in that passage we come to see Jesus' clear admission of who he is. The clearest personal claim to messianic status lodged by Jesus is found in his actions in the triumphal entry. If you recall, this is Jesus riding in on a donkey into Jerusalem days before his death and crucifixion. And there we come to see a recognition by the people, his followers and others, that there's something about this man, hence them waving palms at him. Also, we have the scene of Jesus cleansing the temple. That is, Jesus coming to the temple of Jerusalem, overturning tables in which people are changing money and making offerings and buying offerings to sell in the temple. And so Jesus is overturning this system in a way of buying one's connection with God. At the same time, he's come to recognize the value in it too. It's an interesting dichotomy. Remember, we looked last time about how Jesus has to have been a Jew, and therefore, and we do see that. I mean, when he was a boy, going to the temple, offering sacrifice as well throughout his life. And so, in a way, what he's doing here is reacting against the high economics, that are involved with the temple cult. And then finally, we have Jesus' admission, rather a voice's admission of who Jesus is in the transfiguration scene. Here we have Peter, James, and John who travel up a mountain with Jesus, and something miraculous happens. He's levitating, and next to him are Moses and Elijah, and Jesus is in dazzling white. And here we have the voice of God saying, "This is my Son." When we look through the Gospels, we find that there isn't one shred of evidence that suggests that Jesus is a military Messiah. Rather, we have what anthropologist Marvin Harris calls the peaceful Messiah to describe the Gospel picture of Jesus. Indeed, the Gospel traditions are so filled, imbued with this theme, that it is plausible to assume that it was organic to them. And in your textbooks on 232, you can find lots of examples of that. And so when we have Jesus depicted as a peaceful Messiah, would that be able to stand at Jesus' time? And the answer is yes. There was a notion abroad in rabbinic Judaism that the coming of the Messiah and the realization of the Messianic kingdom could be advanced by devotion to Torah. So devotion to God not through the temple, but through the word, the Torah. Finally, the fact that Jesus chided both his disciples and others for their dullness in not grasping what he was about suggests that in his own mind, he was not confronting them with something absolutely strange and radical, but with something they should have been able to understand, and that is a simple, peaceful Messiah figure. Interestingly, Jesus himself may have added to Jewish messianic ideas with the notion of the Messiah as suffering servant. In the prophets, we see, particularly in Isaiah chapter 40 to 55, the servant songs, which were collectively interpreted as Israel personified. Maybe Jesus picked up this notion and annexed it for himself. Jesus is whose suffering and unjust death achieve vicarious good to his own messianic understanding. Now we turn to another title attributed to Jesus, Son of God. Persons in the pagan environment of the Roman Empire were probably accustomed to understanding the ascription of Son of God. This was commonly applied to the emperor or to kings, and for Jews, this was applied to the Davidic kings, some kings. Note, for example, in Psalm 2 and 89, as well as 2 Samuel 7. And so it would have been not unusual for the early Christians to apply that term Son of God to Jesus as well. We also have evidence that the term Son of God was applied to someone who behaved in a godly fashion, who does God's work in this world. And so again, for early Christians, this would not have been an unusual practice. It can also be observed that on two notable occasions, a voice from heaven proclaimed Jesus the Son of God. The first at his baptism, and you can see the citations there in the slide, as well as the transfiguration, which I just talked about. The next title we have attributed to Jesus is Son of Man. Son of Man is apparently Jesus' favorite term of self-reference in the Gospels. The most common meaning of Son of Man in the Hebrew Scriptures is simply human being. It's God's favorite form of address to the prophet Ezekiel, who he refers to as Son of Man throughout. Vermes, the biblical scholar, has shown that in Aramaic writing, especially in letters from around the time of Jesus, Son of Man was a euphemism for the first-person pronoun I. To be used when to say I or me would sound overly self-important or to avoid linking oneself with language concerning unfortunate events. And so here we see that Son of Man is a literary device used by writers or even by Jesus himself to refer to himself. Now, it could be that in some cases the phrase is used as a title in the apocalyptic sense, as seen in Enoch, who introduces a heavenly savior figure who bears the title Son of Man. Now, this was not a book that we covered, but it is one of those books that is not in any canon. It's an apocryphal work altogether, and would have been in existence around the time of Jesus. And so, could this concept have been picked up by Jesus himself or the early Christian community? Who knows? If so, the issue becomes whether Jesus considered himself this figure, Son of Man, who would return in glory, or whether he used the term in reference to another besides himself, who would come later. And finally, we have the last title attributed to Jesus, and that is Lord. Based on language, it is difficult to understand the use of the term Lord. Why? The New Testament was written in Greek, and so the word for Lord was kurios. The Aramaic word mar was interchangeable with kurios, but mar could refer to God or as a title for a respected person, and this was the same for the Greek. In modern-day Greek, kurios is Mr. And in ancient times, kurios was also applied to a deity in Hellenistic cults. So it's tough to say how the term was used for Jesus. Now, although the title Lord is both complex and confusing, some things can be asserted with reasonable confidence. First, Jesus' Jewish contemporaries would not address him with the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. Nor is it likely that as a Jew, Jesus would have made such an attribution to himself. That would have been considered a sin, it would have been considered blasphemy. Next, Aramaic-speaking Christian communities use the term as an affirmation that the now risen Jesus represented the lordship of God on earth. And so if you were an early Christian who would have experienced the resurrection, the resurrected Jesus, or stories about the resurrected Jesus, you would have come to see that Jesus was something more. He was someone who was Lord over death. In the next point, it is most likely that the application of the term to Jesus was a form of polite or deferential address, which we talked about. The fact that the Greek term kurios was used in the pagan referring to deities probably colored the way it was understood by Gentiles in that world. And so as Christianity spread into the Gentile world and as Gentiles became Christian, use of the term kurios applied to Jesus would have come with some interesting baggage to it.